I was standing at the Cedar Grove bus stop before dawn, the sky still the colour of old pennies. My hands smelled like lemon dish soap, and the last of the coffee my son had poured for himself and not for me. The morning air was sharp enough to sting the inside of my ears. I had no money, no jacket that didn't have a hole in the sleeve, and a heart that felt bruised in a way that didn't make sense for someone my age. I was 62, and the world had always been something I navigated for others. Children, a husband, students. Now the world felt like a place I was waiting in, but no one had said when the next car would come. My son's words echoed and ricocheted off the white bus shelter. "I can't take you anymore, Mum. I'm sorry. I can't take you anymore." He'd said it 3 times, as if saying it made it truer, as if repetition was a hammer, and every time the hammer came down a little harder. We had argued, yes. The argument had been terrible and ordinary. Unpaid bills, small angers accumulated like dust, a pride neither of us admitted, but he had also been carrying a weight that didn't belong to me, responsibility he had not asked for, and a defeat he didn't know how to own. I had lived on the kindness of strangers and the patience of my sister for years, and now my son's patience had a door with a lock and a late notice slip for a key. A bus rumbled by without stopping. The shelter's bench creaked when I sat, bones making small complaints. People passed with the focused stride of those who belong somewhere, gestures of a community that was not mine at that moment. I thought of the room in my son's house that had been mine for 2 years, a room I had furnished with care, and a softness that had imagined I'd become part of his family again after my husband died. There were framed photos on his bookshelf. Him at 20, in a graduation gown. Me at 50, with a ridiculous hat at a wedding. Pictures that made you believe in continuity. Now they felt like props. He had taken my wallet because he thought I would spend what little I had on something foolish. He had taken my bus card because he said I would disappear into the city and never call. He had pushed me out, in the literal and the figurative sense. The tantrum had ended with him slamming the door, and me standing on the front step, with my tote bag and a bus timetable clutched like a compass that pointed to nothing. A figure sat down at the other end of the bench. At first I only noticed the hat, a navy knit beanie, clean, worn at the edges. The man was small in profile, and seemed at first look like any stranger who might pass you by. Then he spoke. "Cold morning," he said. His voice had the grain of someone who had smoked once upon a time, or perhaps of someone who had met too many winters. It was soft, and it didn't ask anything of me beyond the fact that I noticed he had spoken. He laughed then, a little light sound, like a pocket of warmth. "Right? For early spring?" "I guess so." My reply came out thinner than I wanted. The words, "my son," almost erupted from me like a confession, but I swallowed them and watched his hands instead, folded on a cane I hadn't noticed before. There was a slight wear at the palms, a map of small scars, as if he had held the world up with those hands and been rewarded with nicks. He turned his head slightly toward me, though I couldn't tell if his eyes moved. "You look like you could use a good story," he said, "or a bad cup of coffee. Which one do you prefer?" For a moment I considered refusing. The reflex built from a life that taught me not to accept charity. But the bench already felt like an auditorium, and this man a narrator, leaning in with a promise. "I'll take a story," I said. They called him Mr. Wallace, by everyone in the neighbourhood. He had been a teacher, of history he later told me, which explained the gentle way he accepted people's interruptions. It also explained the cadence of his sentences, measured as if he were always at the front of a classroom, waiting for a hand to raise. "I used to teach at Lincoln High," he said, and I nodded though I'd never heard of it. "For 30 years. Loved the kids. Hated the budget cuts. You know the routine. But I tell stories now for people who will listen. For myself sometimes. I'm looking for a bus," I admitted, "to the shelter downtown, or to my sister's. I'm not sure. Transport's unpredictable," he said. "But kindness, that's another kind of transport. It takes you places if you let it." We talked then, in the way people talk when they have nothing better to do than be honest with a stranger. He told me about the coffee shop 2 blocks down that gave him the last free muffin of the morning because he always sang a verse of something from his youth. I told him about my son, about the argument that had finally broken the dam. He didn't ask for details. He didn't offer platitudes. "Would it bother you to pretend?" he asked suddenly, after a silence that smelled faintly of mint. "Would you mind pretending to be my wife for 10 minutes? The question landed like a dropped teacup. I looked at him, thinking he meant it as a joke, some eccentric attempt to break the sorrow with absurdity. "Your wife?" I asked. He nodded. "My friend has a driver who runs errands in the mornings. He helps folks get where they need to go. Sometimes he gives rides to people who look like they could use them more than money in their pockets. If I say she's with me, he won't leave us on the curb. The world is kinder with a label." I pictured myself, a 62-year-old woman, pretending to be someone else to get a ride. The idea was humiliating and practical in equal measure. My pride was a stubborn thing, but so was the thinness of my bank account. I thought of my son's closed door, and my sister's small apartment, and the bus that might not come at all. "You'd do that?" I asked. "If it will get you somewhere warm, yes," he said. He held out his hand, without expecting me to take it. It was a gesture more than an offer. "And if you don't mind an extra person waiting in the coffee shop, I can buy the coffee." I always carry cash for the coin machine. The old habits die hard. So we did it. We walked to the coffee shop with the small lie between us like a bandage. He introduced me in the simplest way. "This is my wife, Margaret." The barista smiled politely at my name and did not ask for proof. The driver, an oversized man named Luis, who smelled like oranges and car wax, pushed a small sedan up to the curb and looked like he owned every road he'd ever driven. Luis blinked at us when Mr. Wallace said we were together in the same breath, then shrugged, as if the world was full of arrangements, and none of them his business. He opened his trunk and unfolded a ramp, as if he did this often, though there was no wheelchair to be seen. He lined the seats with blankets. He asked no intrusive questions and listened to Mr. Wallace tell a joke about a history teacher whose students thought the Revolutionary War was a fossil. He refused payment when Mr. Wallace offered it, saying, "We do what we can." We rode to St. Mark's Community Centre, a low brick building with a mural of people holding hands on the side. Inside there was warmth and the smell of cinnamon rolls and soap. A woman at the desk signed me in as if I belonged there already. They gave me soup and a cot, and a number to call for assistance. They asked my name, my birthday, if I needed medical help. The world lent me things, slowly and carefully, like you would hand a child an unfamiliar toy. "You did the right thing," Mr. Wallace said, when he took my hands in his with the urgency of someone who had made many right decisions, and many wrong ones. Sometimes pretending is the first step toward being honest again. That afternoon, a volunteer named Hannah took me under her wing. She had a badge that said, "Community Navigator," and a laugh that made you believe she knew where everything important was kept. She helped me apply for emergency assistance, connected me with a housing counsellor, and taught me how to use the shelter's phone to call my sister. In the evenings, I sat in the rec room with a towel drying my feet and listened to the chatter of people who were getting their lives back one small favour at a time. I thought often of my son. It was foolish, perhaps, to think that he would feel anything but a weight lifted. He had given me a curt goodbye and the slam of a door that sounded like finality. But mothers live with a belief in the elasticity of love. I held that elastic in my heart and stretched it toward him, wondering where it might snap back. Mr. Wallace came to visit. He sat in the same rec room where a television showed a looping documentary about city parks. He handed me a book of poems and circled some lines with a stubborn pencil. "Read these," he said. "They'll help you be patient." I read aloud sometimes for the people who shared cots with me. The words were old company. A man named Jerome, who had been a mechanic and had hands like small tools, would listen and add commentary, like a friend who'd been on the road. A woman named Esther, who played the harmonica for any occasion, tapped her foot when I happened upon a rhythm. We became a small community that traded stories like currency. Weeks turned into 2 months by the shelter's calendar. I learned the routines: soup at noon, meetings on Mondays, an indoor gardening class with windows that let in the summer light like a patient hand. I volunteered at the front desk, learning to answer the phone with a steady voice and direct people to the right help. That steady voice was a surprise. Sometimes losses come with the odd gift of a new tool. One evening, the shelter hosted a talent night. People brought guitars, poems, and a patchwork of courage. I stood up, my knees aware of the moment, and told the story of the bus stop. I told it like a confession, and like a thank you. I told it slowly, the words tripping over themselves at first and then finding a pace. And when I finished, the room clapped. A modest, sincere clap. I felt a warmth that was not pity. My son kicked me out of the car without any money, I said when I told the shelter's counsellor later. He said he couldn't take me anymore. Saying the words to someone who was paid to listen made them feel official. They had happened. The counsellor, a woman with a scar on her thumb who smiled in a way that let you know regret was manageable, suggested mediation and a visit with a social worker who specialised in family reunification. I resisted the idea at first. Pride is a river that will not be dammed without effort. But there was a small part of me that wanted to see my son's face when he understood what we had both done. The mediation appointment was held in a small conference room downtown at a legal services office. The mediator sat at the head, in a sweater that had a threadbare near the cuff. He asked both of us to speak without interruption. I dialed my son's number with a hand that still remembered the whirl of buttons and felt like a foreign object. He answered on the first ring, the voice a little rougher than I remembered, the cost of nights spent worrying, the timbre of someone who had been doing more than I had ever seen him do. "Hi, Mom," he said. It was not the same as, "I'm sorry." It wasn't meant to be, but it was a beginning. We spoke, with the mediator asking questions that felt like careful pebbles thrown across a river. What happened here? What are your needs? What does each of you want? My son told me about the bills and the late payments, and the way that responsibility had worn him down until snapping was the only action left on the menu. He told me about sleeping on the couch because he thought that if he slept with his door closed, he could pretend the problem didn't exist. He was younger than I had pictured when I thought of a man who could slam doors and walk away. My memory had kept him in a sort of adolescence, a timelessness, and the mediation chair was a rude moment of recognition. He was a man, with worries, with a job that frayed his patience, with debts, and a partner to consider. He was also my son. We did not reconcile in the tidy, cinematic way that makes for good storytelling. There were no tears at the table that fixed everything, but we took baby steps. He agreed to contribute a small amount to my rent at a transitional housing program. He agreed to attend a few family counseling sessions. I agreed to find my own place, a small apartment offered by a housing program for seniors leaving shelters. The mediator handed us a list of community resources and asked us to call him if anything fell apart. "Call me," he said, "even if it's just to say hello. People break things. That's human. Mending is the part that's hard. Let's make a plan to try." When I moved into my studio apartment above a laundromat 3 blocks from the community centre, I painted the walls a colour that made me think of cornfields in August. It felt like making a promise to myself that I could be small and have good light. I worked part-time at the shelter's front desk because no job is wasted when it connects you to people and purpose. I started a small group at the community centre for seniors who had been isolated. We made soup and cardigans and swapped stories about the best pie crusts. You'd be surprised how many of the things that stitch a life are simple ones. The right soup, a phone call that doesn't ask much, a friend who knows when to say nothing at all. My son and I agreed to meet for coffee once a week. Our conversations were sometimes about bills, sometimes about his cat, sometimes about small, ordinary things, like the way the light fell over the deli on Maple Street. Life negotiated us slowly. He would come and sit at the kitchen table with a bagel and read the paper. Sometimes he would fall asleep on the couch and I'd notice his shoulders loosen, as if we were all testing muscles we hadn't used in a while. The real gift, however, was what happened with Mr. Wallace. He kept appearing like a punctuation mark in my sentences at first. A visit here, a cup of soup there. He had a way of being quietly present, not making my life about him but making room for mine. He taught me to enjoy the early mornings when the laundromat windows shone like polished coins. He introduced me to the neighborhood's book club, a group of misfits and old teachers who loved to argue gently. He introduced me to the idea of listening as an art. One evening, as autumn folded the trees like a blanket, Mr. Wallace suggested something that changed the shape of the life I was building. "You should tell your story," he said, as if it were the simplest, most logical sentence in the world. Not the one about being kicked out, but the one that starts there and ends somewhere else. People need to hear how we go on. I thought of the talent night, of the hush that had followed my telling. There had been a woman there who recorded our evenings on her phone and posted them on a channel called Her Stories, Her Voice. She had asked if I would tell my story again for a broader audience. The idea was terrifying. The thought of strangers listening to my sorrow made me want to hide. But Mr. Wallace shook his head, small and emphatic. "You don't have to be brave," he said. "You get to be honest." So I did it. We filmed my story in the rec room, with the harmonica woman tapping a rhythm in the corner. I sat on the bench and told the tale of the car door, of the bench, of Mr. Wallace and the ride to St. Mark's. I told it like a road, not a cliff, like something with lane markers and a rest stop. When the video was edited, there were small pauses where I choked on a word and then found it again. That was the footage that seemed honest. The video went up on a weekday. And then, like many small things now, it moved in unexpected directions. Someone described it as quietly fierce, and someone else wrote that I had the face of someone who had lived. I got messages, 3, then 15, then hundreds. People wrote about their own mothers, their own doors, their own benches. A mother in Ohio said she'd finally found the words to leave an abusive marriage after watching my face. A college student said he cried because he'd never realized a small kindness could rearrange a life. A woman named Lula offered to knit me a blanket. A man sent 2 tickets for a train trip to Chicago with a note that said, "For a change of scenery." And then, a stranger left a comment that changed everything again. He said, "If you are Margaret from Cedar Grove, my son works at a non-profit that helps families in situations like yours. He heard your story on the radio." It was a tiny thread, but that thread tied together a handful of people who cared. My son called me 3 days later. He had seen the video, he said, and had been quiet for a long time. "You were brave," he said. "I watched you sitting there, and I realized I made a mistake." The apology this time had a long pause, as if he were learning how to carry something gentle. He offered not just words, but action. He volunteered at the shelter, starting with a single hour a week. He listened to other people there, and sometimes his face was softer, as if someone had unknotted a piece of him. In the months that followed, our relationship reassembled itself, not as it had been, but as something more careful, more respectful. We argued sometimes, yes, old habits die hard, but the slams of doors were replaced by closed mouths, and later, conversation. He helped me set up my small apartment for winter. I showed him where the best pie crusts came from. We learned to let the past be part of the foundation, without being the whole house. The real miracle, however, was the community that grew like moss in the cracks of my fragile days. People who had watched my video came to the shelter to volunteer. A local radio station hosted a fundraiser, and we raised enough to create a small emergency fund for seniors. Hannah, the community navigator, became a friend. She organized potlucks and therapy groups and pushed us all to be better to one another. Mr. Wallace was always there, a constancy in the way a lighthouse proves the shore exists. He turned out to be not only a retired teacher, but a veteran who had lost his sight gradually to glaucoma. He had a daughter who lived across the river and 2 cats who were the size of small arguments. He never took credit for the small kindness that had started it all. He preferred to compare actions to dominoes. "One push," he'd say, "and the rest take care of themselves if you set them up right." One Saturday, a year after I'd been kicked out at dawn, the shelter held an open house. People who had once fled or stumbled through its doors came back to show what they'd made of themselves. My son and I stood at a long table with a basket of pies from a fundraiser. People lined up to buy a slice and sit with someone they hadn't known before. We talked about jobs and repair bills and the weather. We talked about houses we'd lost and new ones we'd found. There was laughter that had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. At the end of the day, Mr. Wallace and I walked home in the wash of an orange sunset. He held my elbow the way one holds a lamp and not a life. "You did the hard work," he said. "You told the truth. You asked for help when you needed it." "You did something too," I said. "You showed up." He shrugged as if that had been the smallest thing. "We all show up, if given half a chance. Sometimes that chance looks like a smile at the bus stop." We paused at the corner, where a young woman with a stroller struggled with a flat tire. We helped her, the 3 of us. And in the act, there was a full circle. Hands and stories passed like a package from one person to another. Years move in strange patterns. They don't always tie up neat endings. My son and I did not become a myth of healing that never mentions the scaffolding. We simply grew more honest about who we were. I met new friends and kept old ones. I worked on a memoir that was less about grand sentimental truth and more about the daily decisions that make a life worth living. Showing up, choosing patience, refusing to let humiliation be the final word. People still wrote to me. Sometimes the messages were thank you notes, sometimes simple photographs of pies and cats. Once, a woman wrote to tell me that she and her mother had reconciled after watching my video. Once, another man wrote, a stranger, to say that he'd been Mr. Wallace for someone that week, that he had used the small ruse of claiming a woman as his wife to ensure she got a ride home, and that the lie had turned into the bridge she needed. The world was more delicate and full of strange tenderness than any of us had thought. On the anniversary of the bus stop, I took a walk to the corner where it had happened. The bench had been repainted, and someone had carved a small heart into the wood with a key. I sat, and the air smelled like rain about to come. A teenager skateboarded past and tipped his cap without meaning to be kind. A woman walked her dog and smiled at the way the dog leapt into puddles. My son met me there with a paper bag and a coffee. We sat in the warmth of nothing much and everything at once. I'm sorry, he said, as if he had just learned the most important word in a foreign language. He didn't wrap it in explanation this time. He said it and let it stand. For what? I asked. For not hearing you sooner. For being selfish. For being afraid. I took his hand, which fit into mine the way a puzzle piece finds its match. For throwing me out? I asked. The old hurt and a new softness braided together. He laughed, a low sound. For scaring you. For not being better. In all the ways that matter. He shifted, then produced a small folded envelope. Inside was an appointment card for a counsellor he had started seeing, and beside it, a small list he'd written of things he wanted to change in himself. I looked at him, and for a moment the years fell into a heap, and we picked them up together. The story of the car door was not erased. It was a seam in the fabric of our family. It showed where the cloth had been repaired. The repaired parts would always be visible, but they made the garment stronger. As the sun finally slid under the edge of the city, Mr. Wallace appeared as he always did, like punctuation in my day. He sat at the end of the bench with the calm of someone who knows the arc of a life is long, and that the small sentences within it matter immensely. You learned how to tell the story, he said. More statement than question. That's rare. I learned how to listen, I answered, to myself and to others. We sat together then. 3 people in the light that lets you see without exposing you completely. Cars hummed by, the world continuing its indifferent, generous business. There was no grand pronouncement, no miraculous epiphany. There was only the steady business of living, making small amends, building small joys, offering a hand to someone who is waiting on a bench. That was enough. It was, in its quiet way, everything. If you ever find yourself on a bench that seems like the end of the world, wait a minute. Sometimes a stranger will sit with you. Sometimes that stranger will ask you to be someone else, just long enough to get you to a better place. Sometimes the better place is a shelter. Sometimes it's a studio apartment painted the color of cornfields. Sometimes it's a room at a kitchen table where the person who hurt you learns how to be better. And sometimes, more often than you'd think, the best part is the way people show up when given the smallest permission to be kind. So I found the edge of my life and stepped over it. I learned to tell the story that began with a slammed door and ended with a table full of pie. The world did not owe me anything, and yet it gave me everything I needed. A bench, a blind man with a hat and a cane, a driver named Luis who smelled like oranges, a shelter that took me in, a community that taught me how to be small and brave. In the end, the story was not about being left. It was about finding the people who would help you come home. If you believe in anything, believe in small things that have big consequences. Believe in a stranger offering her hand at a bus stop. Believe in the stubbornness of people who refuse to let you disappear. Believe that even when a son says he can't take you anymore, there are always others who will choose you for no reason other than that you exist. And when you can, be that someone for another person. Be the hand, the beanie, the driver who opens his trunk. Be the listener who doesn't rush the confession. There is no better story than the one where someone shows up,